Hello everyone, what is going on? My name is Timpedia and welcome to my birthday special for 2017, my 26th birthday. For last year, I did my top 20-ish games of all time. This year, I wanted to celebrate something else that I love. Shocking to many people, I actually love to read as well. I know lots of people who look down on books a lot more heavily than they look down on video games, but I actually love to read. I've had a Kindle for about 5 years now this year, and I've used it almost every, if not day, at least week, reading something. So what I wanted to do was, like last year, I'm going to do a list of a bunch of things, but unlike last year, there's going to be two different themed videos instead of two parts. This part one is going to be all of the books that I really love and the series that I really love that are not Star Wars related, and they're not in any particular order. But with the next video, those will be all the Star Wars books, at least some of which you can probably guess based on my top 10s that I've done before. But regardless, I'm going to go through and name a bunch of important Star Wars series for myself. But this video is going to be focused on the non-Star Wars books that I absolutely love that I think you guys should know about. Starting here at number 1, we're probably going to be working our ways from my youngest series to my oldest series, the ones I started reading when I was super young, a teenager, and all the way to the ones I discovered probably within the last few years. So starting out with that in mind, the first and oldest series of books that I read as a kid, when I was probably a teenager in middle school or high school, I started reading the Artemis Fowl series. A whole bunch of books about a basically a criminal mastermind who finds out that who basically proves that fairies are real, captures one, and tries to extort them for money. And from there, it just goes more and more. The character development is fantastic. Artemis himself, I loved as a kid because I saw him as the cold genius that I knew I wasn't, but I always liked to think of myself as smart when I was a kid. No kid's really as smart as they think they are. But just reading about the amazing things that he did as a teenager was so inspiring to someone who was interested in like engineering and the sciences. I always liked engineering, and so Artemis doing a lot of engineering-related things, a lot of smart, techie things, as only a 13-year-old boy, really obviously appealed to me as a teenage kid. As the books go on and on, his relationships with the fairies change. Even at halfway through the series, or about 2/3 of the way through the series, his mind gets wiped, and yet the series keeps going. It kind of drags on a little bit by the end, and there's one overarching villain who just doesn't seem to go away. But overall, I really, really love the Artemis Fowl series. I definitely think it helped inspire my love of technology, especially the third book, The Eternity Code, or is it The Eternity Cube? Whichever one it is. It's on the screen. That book, the blue cover, the cube that he builds is basically this magical technological cube, and I thought that was the coolest thing, especially because that was before smartphones were a thing, really, or they were like just starting. So that book really hit me hard because I was just getting into computers and PC gaming and things like that. So I was so excited at this prospect of this amazing technology before it was even as much of a thing. So that's where a lot of that love of tech came from. And I definitely think it's the series that I read when I was the youngest that helped influence who I am today the most. The next entry on this list is a series that is probably more famous than the Artemis Fowl series, mostly because while Artemis Fowl was potentially going to be turned into a movie, the first book of this next series was turned into a wildly unsuccessful movie adaptation that was terrible. This is the Aragon series, a story of a teenage boy. Again, started reading this when I was in middle school and high school, who finds a dragon egg and it hatches, and lo and behold, he now has a dragon, and he goes on wild adventures with magic and everything. Again, you can see why a boy who loves fantasy like me would be so into this kind of thing. Especially coming off of Artemis Fowl, where there was this super techie, while some magic sci-fi kind of series. Aragon really brought more in this fantasy element with things like dragons, while at the same time I was about to get into Dungeons and Dragons a few years after I started reading this. It also helped that the author of this series, Christopher Paolini, was only 18 or 16, I forget, at the time when he wrote the first Aragon book. So, for a teenage boy, what's more inspiring and cool than, or at least a nerd like me, I guess, what's more inspiring and cool than another teenage boy who's only a few years older, who is a published famous author who writes a book about a young boy finding a dragon egg and learning magic? The answer is there really isn't any. From the lore that they build over the 4 books, to the awesome relationships that everyone has, to the honestly not super happy ending, there's just so much there. And even after the last book got split into a 3rd and 4th book, like so many movies are these days, like Hunger Games and things like that, it didn't really matter. It was just more time to explore and learn about this world and watch him. You really feel this sense of progress as he travels, because like a lot of books, it comes with a map, which is fine. But when you feel the days tick by with Aragon, it just feels awesome. And it feels like you're there on the road when he describes like stealing a horse so that they can get along. Him and his mentor can travel before he can ride his dragon, trying to learn how to ride the dragon, trying to hide the dragon, because obviously dragons aren't great in this book series. You got to read it. But again, this just played into my sense of being a teenager, loving fantasy, loving dragons, because I mean, most people, even if they don't like dragons, they don't dislike dragons. So for a boy who did love dragons and especially loves magic, it was a big heavy hitter of a series. In the birthday special last year, I tied in a few memories to personal events. I remember the second book in the Aragon series, Eldest, I believe, came out right after or right before my family took a trip to Disney World in, I can't remember when. And I bought the book in Disney World for a bunch of money. I took what little allowance money I had, and I bought it in, I can't remember the name of the store, something that started with a V, and we didn't have it around where I lived, but it was some huge store, and they just happened to have it, and I bought it, and I read it every spare second. And near the end of the day, my dad and my brother wanted to keep going on roller coasters, but I'm not a roller coaster person. But I was old enough at the time for my parents to let me go back to the hotel room, where I just plopped down and just read through like half the book in that first night. So that's one of my memories that I always have of Disney World, is reading that book vigorously that first time when I bought it. I was so excited to get my hands on it. I finished it right away. I think I finished it before we even left to go home. Certainly probably read it again before we got finished getting home on the plane. But yeah, so there's another one, the Aragon series. But don't worry, it's not all about high fantasy and magic. So now we're entering an interesting period. Artemis Fowl and Aragon I read when I was in high school, or middle school and high school. And around the same time I was reading Aragon, I was picking up Star Wars books. I was gobbling them up, because obviously the old Star Wars Expanded Universe had so many books. When I got into it right at the end of the New Jedi Order, right when Swarm War was happening. So there were so many books that I could grab. It was crazy. So there's a long period from the end of high school all the way till when I left my first college 2.5 years later, where I only really read Star Wars books as my new books. Nothing major. However, around the middle of my first college, before I left there for money reasons, basically, I started buying Humble Bundles. They were so awesome back then. I haven't bought a Humble Bundle in months. But I was really into it in the beginning, and then I bought a Kindle while I was off from school, and I started buying Star Wars books on it, and I started reading on it a lot. And then, right afterward, Humble Bundle comes out with the Humble ebook bundle, which I bought immediately. And I don't think I've bought one since, and none of the books popped out to me as much, except for one called The Reluctant Swordsman, which was good enough that I proceeded to buy the whole series. Now, if we were to rank all of the book series on this list, this would probably be near the bottom, but that's not speaking against its quality. It's just not, it doesn't hit me as hard as the ones I had when I was younger. And since I read Reluctant Swordsman, I've read things that have hit me harder and more on a more personal level. But Reluctant Swordsman was awesome. It's basically this mostly Japanese world where the entire civilization lives along a giant river, and a man named Wally Smith dies in America. He dies here, and the goddess who runs this world, just called the world, basically brings his spirit and implants him in who is basically the strongest swordsman of the age, who was tasked with some holy mission for her, and he failed. And so she basically she made him go to the biggest temple in the world, get exorcised, and during the exorcism kicked him out of his own mind and replaced him with Wally Smith. And from there, he has to learn the ways of the world, recover his skill as a swordsman, basically find an apprentice, and then eventually find out what the holy mission he was supposed to be doing was, and find out not only how it has, like, what he has to do, but he also finds out why the original man Shanzu failed and why he is the man who was brought here. It wasn't just for this mission. There's so much more to it than that. But it's a really awesome series. It's a lot of intrigue. It's really cool. It's kind of like time travel, but not exactly, because there's no going back. But it's this man who was, I believe he was a chemical engineer, basically learning how to function in this society with numerous rules and being this incredible swordsman and learning to live a completely new life in this new place, and seeing how the world, he literally reshapes the world without even really trying to in the beginning, just by being himself and being from a different time. But he also has so much to offer, and it's not an amazing series, but it's certainly not bad, and it's one of my most memorable. It's one of the ones I've reread on my Kindle a bunch of times, just because it's so interesting. It's kind of like a new take on time travel. There's not really any magic, but there's mysticism, if that makes sense. There's no outright magic in the world, but this whole goddess and religion thing, and it turns out to kind of be a religious war, kind of, just puts it in a whole new light. So I really like it. It's the Reluctant Swordsman series. So here's the entry that's going to hit most home in relation to my channel, and it actually is hilarious how it kind of eases into the next series. But this is where I'm going to just talk about the broad spectrum of video game books out there, and this kind of breaks into not three, but a few categories. The first one I'm going to talk about is the standalone book BioShock Rapture. I love this book because it gives you such an awesome idea of how Rapture, when you play the first BioShock game, you get this sense of this faded glory of this place. But BioShock Rapture takes you from the moment Andrew Ryan decides to build Rapture almost to the moment of the first game, and you see that rise and fall of glory, and it even kind of sets up the second game. But it's such an amazing journey to see how the struggles to save Rapture and then the struggles to tear it down, and how things change so much, and how it's almost a study in how Ryan's ideal is corrupted by himself, kind of, by like the idea he had was so fascinating and almost could have worked if it wasn't for him basically at his core wanting to play the system for himself. Like, he loves the rules he's established, but then he finds that the power is so hard to lose. And so if you liked the tone and feel and story of the first BioShock game, I highly recommend BioShock Rapture. I got to go through these quick because this is a big topic. Another minor one is the Doom 3 books. There's also books for the old Doom games, but they are so hard to find and expensive. I've bought the second of 4 original Doom story books at a Barnes & Noble on a discount rack, and I've never found a good price on another one, and they're not available in ebook at all. But the ones that I've read on ebook are the Doom 3 novelization books. They basically expand the story a little bit, and they tweak the story to fit with being a character who actually speaks and interacts with people. It's nothing fantastic, but it's just an awesome way to kind of get another take on the same story through a different medium. To jump parts a little bit, Shadows of the Empire does this a lot in Star Wars, the way you had the book, the comic, and the video game. It's just so cool to see different perspectives and different takes on a story and different ways to experience a story. And that's why I like the Doom 3 books, because I didn't actually hate Doom 3 as a game. It's not, having played the new Doom this year, the new Doom is better and more fun. But Doom 3 I didn't think was that bad, actually. It was a fun, kind of tense game, and it was probably as close to horror as I like. I don't really like horror games, so that's why I liked it more, I think. Then we get into the two big ones. The first one is Mass Effect. There's 4 main Mass Effect novels, and I've only read some of the comics, but the novels are great because they really expand Captain Anderson and, as seen barely in the third game, Kaylee Sanders, and even a little bit Kai Lang. These books just do such an amazing job of fleshing out who is really one of the most important characters, Captain Anderson. When he talks to Shepard in the first game about how he had his shot at being a Spectre and Saren screwed him out of it, that's the story of the first game, is how they crossed paths the first time. And then the second, third, and fourth book do this great job of establishing that Cerberus isn't this incompetent, just super duper evil thing. The last 3 books are really focused on this girl named Gillian Grayson and her father who works for Cerberus, and it's really the evolution of all of these characters. Anderson and Sanders, they both evolve over the course of the series, but it's also so much about Cerberus, and it gives them so much more of a feel than in the video game where they're just bad guys to shoot or the super evil monsters. Because even in the second game, you never really feel like you're on the Elusive Man's side, but you understand a lot more about his motivations, and you get some glimpses into his actual character through the books where you can see how he does. You actually get to see from his point of view, and you understand his thought process a lot more, and it really does expand the games. But the final one I want to talk about is actually kind of the most disappointing for me. Halo. Growing up, the first console I had was an N64, and I didn't get a new one until my brother and I had to share an Xbox starting in like 8th or 9th grade. When I was in 8th or 9th grade, we got an Xbox original, and we got Halo. And I loved Halo and eventually I found the books. Fall of Reach, Flood, and First Strike were amazing, and then they started writing those books are fantastic. I actually love those books. Then we go into Ghosts of Onyx, which is great, and then things like Contact Harvest, which are pretty good. The problem with the Halo books, and the reason they're a really sad story, is twofold. One, they started writing really weird books. They started writing basically from the point of view of the Forerunners. But those books are super hard sci-fi, and I've never been as into that. They just are very high-minded, and it's good for understanding their really weird technology, but it's a lot to process, and I don't really love it. And then secondly, Karen Traviss has been writing newer books, and she seems to have a lot of same feelings that she's carried over from writing the Republic Commando books, and her writing kind of isn't great again. I used to be so on board, if you watch my top 10 Star Wars things, of those Commando books, but then you kind of look at Star Wars in the larger picture, and you see how Karen Traviss has this inherent desire to kind of make the Mandalorians amazing and like the honor of the Mandalorians, and that's not really there, and she kind of does a lot of the same things in Halo, and it kind of hurts the series. But the final death knell for the Halo books for me, honestly, was the game Halo Reach. That's where Halo became a lot less important to me as a person, and where I feel like Halo took a huge turn down in story. The game Halo Reach completely disagrees with almost everything in Ghosts of Onyx forward, and even parts of Fall of Reach. So that game, like I not only did I not enjoy playing it, but even more so, I did not enjoy finding out just how screwed up the story was at that point, and that basically hurt it a lot for me. And that's so I haven't read a lot of recent Halo books, and it's sad because I did love those original books. They were so fantastic. But anyway, we've talked about video game books enough. Let's go on to some other video game books. Just kidding. We're not doing video game books, sort of. So the next two entries on this list are actually individual authors who I found through one reason or another, and through them found a love for all of their books. And the first one I want to talk about is Ari Marmel. The way I found him was when I was looking for video game books to read. At the same time, I was getting into Magic the Gathering, and I found this man, Ari Marmel, who had written the book for Darksiders, which I loved, the first game, and the second game was pretty good too. He had done the Darksiders book and the Magic the Gathering book, because I, over the course of the last about 5 years, 6 years, 7 years even, I have loved Magic. So I sat down and read both of them and immediately wanted to read all of his books. I'm actually rereading one for like the 5th time now, his duology. But Mr. Marmel has written so many books that I've loved so much. He tells stories in such a gritty, down-to-earth way, and he tells... The other thing that's awesome is a lot of authors tend to write the same story again, kind of. But he really switches characters. The book I'm rereading now is The Warlord's Legacy, which is a duology about a man who consorts with demons and does all this evil stuff, this warlord who finds out that the reason he wanted to basically declare war on everyone is because he felt he should rule. And it's almost like this ultimate arrogance, but it stems from this place of good. Whereas then he switches to like Magic, where he writes about two of the most famous characters, Jace Beleren and Liliana Vess, and their relationship with each other, and expands so much and so perfectly on the cards that means so much to me. And then he goes to something like Darksiders, where he writes like this gruff war and this snarky, funny death. And all the characters work so well, and all the stories feel so different and so well fleshed out and so well understood. It's actually fantastic. He's currently writing a series about an old Chicago detective, which kind of ties into our next thing, who's basically a Lord of the Fairies, and he uses luck as his magic, which is so fascinating. He talks about like draining luck from things to make them stop working. It's really an awesome series. I highly recommend, if you like Darksiders or Magic the Gathering, check out his books related to them. And if you like them, try out the rest of his stuff. It's different, but I really love actually everything he's read. I really don't dislike anything except maybe some of another series he wrote called the Widdershins series. About a thief who basically has a god living inside of her head. Yep, let that sink in. If you think it's interesting, I highly suggest you look him up and try him out. But let's move into the other Chicago detective, shall we? This entry on the list is technically more recent than Ari Marmel's stuff, but probably is the most impactful on this list in the last few years for me. And when I looked back at everything, this was the first thing I wanted. This series is pretty much the reason I wanted to do these videos for my birthday. Chicago's only professional wizard is a man named Harry Dresden, and the Dresden Files is a series of currently 15 books written by Jim Butcher, who is now one of my favorite authors as well, along with Mr. Marmel. Man, the Dresden Files, just such... there's no series that I've read that has spoken to me on so many levels and clearly seems written for almost exactly me as the Dresden Files, a man who's conflicted about the darkness he has to undertake, the man who's willing to do anything to do what's right, the man who has a friend who wields a holy sword. I can't spoil the Dresden Files, but the amazing thing about this series is how I found it. There was a period at my old school where I was watching Day 9 because I kind of wanted to watch StarCraft for a little while. And just casually, he mentioned on this one series, he started this one series that lasted like 3 episodes with his friend. I don't remember his name. I haven't watched Day 9 in years, but they talked about the Dresden Files, and I picked up the first one because I liked Day 9 so much at the time. And from there, I've read every single book and every single book Jim Butcher has written, because the Dresden Files is such a fantastic series. A man who is basically, it follows the wizard Harry Dresden as he grows and develops over 15 books. There's almost no stories except Star Wars that has such longevity, and yet at the same time, Star Wars has so many different characters, whereas the whole Dresden Files is built just around one man. It's just it. I don't want to say anything too much about it because it's honestly just fantastic. And then his other books, he started a series called the Windlass Chronicles, which the first book is a tome, and it's fantastic. It's about skyships, basically, but it's not too steampunky. And then his old series called the Codex Alira, which I currently turned into a video game, a D&D series, because I love it so much. I mean, what else do you want me to say? Jim Butcher, I've never followed him on Twitter. I don't know anything about him, but all of his books have spoken to me on such a deep level. It's actually it is such an amazing feeling to read something that feel like it's written for you, I guess is the best way to say it. And I feel like everything he's written has been written for me, and that in itself is almost like magic. So, but for the last series, we'll go back to where we started. So like I said, when we started, it was with Artemis Fowl, when I was just getting into, sci-fi and engineering and technology and teenage genius and all that. Our final series is probably the most indie of them all, if not Reluctant Swordsman. Then it is the Man of War series by Paul Hansinger, I think his name is pronounced. It's a very down-to-earth and smart space strategy book series. It almost reminds me of the X-Wing books. It's one destroyer in the middle of a war between Earth and this race of rat people, but Earth has also split into a bunch of subhuman groups too. So there's all these factions and politics going on. The ship that they're on the whole time is the Cumberland, and the whole story of that ship and how their crew turn into it's kind of the rags to riches, or like the dopey failure group that turns into one of the elites. But funny enough, they don't really turn into one of the elites. They just kind of become competent. But it's all about their captain, who is this young guy who's brash and fiery, but is like super smart. They're super awesome, huge ships. Really smart tactical combat. It's not a massive series, but it's also pretty indie, so it's pretty cheap on Kindle if you want to read it. If you're looking for a good sci-fi series that's not too long, it's only about 3 books now. The 4th one's supposed to come out someday. He's one of those minor authors who's a little older who keeps pushing books back. But if you're looking for a good series, I highly recommend it. It's a lot of fun. It's a really smart, tactical kind of thing. Finally, before we end, kind of related to the Man of War series, is the series that kind of led me into it a bunch. A big part of what inspired me to read Man of War was this series, but it's not finished, and I haven't read all of it, so it's not a full mention. All the other ones, I actually finished everything. Like, I've read all of Ari Marmel, all of Jim Butcher, all those video game books. Kind of a mixed bag there, but that's just Halo being weird. But the one I'm talking about right now is The Old Man's War and its sequel, by John Scalzi. Now, this is the case of a universe that kind of grew faster and it kind of goes in a bunch of weird directions. But I've read most of the Old Man's War series itself. This is also they're kind of expanding this series, and I think there's more books being written by like his son or something. I don't really know, or him, or I think he stopped writing it for a long time and then came back recently. I don't know. I haven't dug into this series as deep, but I do love the original Old Man's War and the first 3 sequels, preferably the first 2. The fourth book is kind of weird. It's basically from the point of view of a young child who somehow saves the whole thing. But the Old Man's War especially is kind of the book that starts it all. It really cements the whole series as great. Earth is alone in a galaxy where humans have a whole empire that Earth isn't part of because of a quote-unquote plague that basically caused Earth to be quarantined. And when people in like more well-off countries like the United States and Europe get really old, they can join up with the colonial defense force of the empire and leave Earth forever. Or colonists can be sent out from poorer countries who also leave forever to establish new colonies, whereas the older people go join the military of the colonial militia, of the colonial security, whatever they're called. And where they go, like as soon as you leave Earth with the main character, immediately things get nuts. It's just a fascinating read. It's very awesome, adventurously sci-fi. There's a whole sense of technology and everything. There's a lot of mystery, but it's not like humans are the most advanced race. We're actually pretty large, but a lot of people don't like us, actually. I know that happens a lot with humans. I mean, I just said Man of War series, the biggest race in the galaxy is at war with us, so. But I really like space books, and I figure this is another good series that I haven't fully dug into, but I can say at least read the book Old Man's War and see where you go from there. And with that, we are finally done with this video. Went a lot longer than I thought it would, and next time, don't worry, part 2, come back. We're going to have Star Wars books. But if you've heard anything on this list that sounds interesting, feel free to leave a comment asking me about it. If you need links or anything, let me know. And if you recommend anything, if you've read any of this stuff and you recommend something else that's good, please shoot it to me. I'm always looking for new books to read. Due to budget constraints, I reread these books a lot, so I know them all very, very well. But I would love to branch out, especially if it's on Kindle and cheaper, because I carry my Kindle with me almost literally everywhere. So anyway, guys, I will see you in part 2.